Hello, my name is Shemia Fagan. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm honored to serve as Oregon's 28th Secretary of State. As you can see, I'm in Washington, D.C. this week on official business, so I couldn't be there with you for the release of this very important report. Instead, I'm coming to you from the U.S. Capitol, where just a year ago, on January 6, 2021, a group of violent insurrectionists and extremists attempted to stop the certification of the last presidential election. 7 people died in connection to the events that day. Today, the Oregon Audits Division will be releasing an advisory report on the growing incidents of domestic terrorism and violent extremism right here in Oregon. But we're also releasing recommendations for how state legislators, law enforcement, and agencies can take immediate action and mitigate the risk of any future incidents. Look, I believe Oregon can be an inclusive democracy where everybody feels safe. But domestic terrorism is an immediate threat to that vision, and we simply can't wait for the next incident to occur. We must do more to prevent individuals from escalating down the pathway to violence. Thank you for being here today and for your attention on this very important report.
Thanks, everyone. I would now like to introduce our Audits Director, Kip Memmott.
Thank you, Ben. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kip Memmott. I'm the Audits Director for the Secretary of State's office. My pronouns are he and him. I want to thank Secretary Fagan for her opening comments and for her always robust support of our audit function. And it was neat to see her, her video today from our magnificent U.S. Capitol. We are really pleased today to issue a really important report entitled, Oregon Can Do More to Mitigate the Alarming Risk of Domestic Terrorism and Violent Extremism Attacks. This report is aligned with the Secretary of State's Audit Division priorities focused on public transparency, public trust, and public safety. As Secretary Fagan noted, attacks on the Oregon State Capitol and U.S. capitals over the last couple of years clearly demonstrated the risk to public safety and the high cost on public resources resulting from domestic terrorism and violent extremism. Our report notes that Oregon is especially at high risk for this type of violence. We were 6th in the country over the last decade in violent extremism attacks. And we just, as I mentioned a second ago, just over the last 2 years, there's ample evidence of violence from extremist groups in our state posing risk to public safety and security. Our review was also initiated in part because of the U.S. Attorney General and the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice, which have elevated domestic terrorism and violent extremism to the highest level of risk in their organizations. And of course, our office is highly tuned into what other oversight entities are doing in the country and where they are emphasizing and putting their resources at risk. I also want to note that these federal agencies, and we point this out in the report, are very concerned about the evolving and changing and increasing nature of violent extremism and domestic terrorism, particularly through the use of social media and online forums. I also just want to note that the U.S. Government Accountability Office, our federal congressional auditors, have issued many audits over recent years discussing domestic terrorism and violent extremism at the federal level, but there's not a lot of activity from audit functions at the state level. And we thought, especially because Oregon's risks are not theoretical, they're actually actual risks that we're facing, that our office needed to move and pivot in and provide some information to the public and to key leadership that hopefully can mitigate these risks, as the Secretary said. I'm not going to detail the report because we're here for your questions, but I do want to note that it is organized in 3 general organizational parts. One is state governance over this area. The other is law enforcement training, and a third is public awareness. And we have broad range of recommendations to strengthen our controls and our efforts to mitigate these risks across those. I did just want to point out before we get to your questions, one risk we found related to governance, and that is that despite Oregon's high risk profile in this area, we are one of only 16 states that do not have specific legislation criminalizing domestic terrorism and violent extremism. So that is one of the recommendations we're intending for legislators to consider as they address this high risk area going forward. The report also notes the disparate impact of these terrorist acts on communities, particularly communities targeted for ethnic and racial reasons. And so we also, just in alignment with our public trust and bringing objective information to the public, wanted to note that this violence affects everybody, no matter where you're from, what your stripe is, what your ideology is, but it particularly impacts those most vulnerable among us, or those who have been historically targeted by this violence. I want to thank the Department of Justice and the Oregon State Police Department for their cooperation with this project. And I want to thank and introduce the audit team, who was led by Olivia Raquette, who was the manager, Casey Kopcho served as the lead, and Bill Newell was the staff on the project, and they did a fantastic job. Ben, I'm going to turn it back to you so we can get to the media's question. And I want to thank all of you for your interest in our work as always. Thank you.
We're good to go to questions now. Again, please feel free to either raise your hand using the Zoom feature, or you can drop your question into the chat, and I would be more than happy to read it out. First hand I see is from Claire Withicum.
Hi, good morning. I had a question about the recommendation to explicitly define or criminalize domestic terror and violent extremism in state law. Did you find any instances of domestic terror or violent extremism that were not able to be prosecuted kind of on the state level because there was no definition or, no criminalization of those acts? I'm wondering what those examples are.
Kip, we've got you on mute, I think.
All right, did I not get it on? My apologies. I was going to ask Casey or Olivia to jump in on that and kind of let us know some of the details from the project perspective and what their research showed from that.
Hi, thank you, Kip, and thank you, Ben, and thank you, Claire. My name is Casey Kopcho. I served as the principal auditor or audit lead for this engagement. I use he, him pronouns. To answer the question, that's not an area that we looked. We didn't look at examples of potential, what could have been defined if the definitions had been categorized in such a way as either Georgia or Vermont or states that we called out in the report that do have definitions on the books. Instead, what we looked at is what currently manifested as an incident as by federal definition, and noted that having conversations, even with any of our stakeholders throughout this engagement, were difficult at best because of the lack of a consistent terminology at the state level.
Thank you, Casey. Appreciate that. Next question I have is from Genevieve, and apologies, Genevieve, I don't have your last name.
Sorry, I don't know why my last name got deleted, but Genevieve Rayom with K2 here. I know that the report says there were 11 of these types of incidents that happened just in 2020 alone. Can you break down just a few of them or a handful of them to give us an idea as the breadth of these kinds of events?
I feel like I'm probably best suited to answer that again. This is Casey Kopcho, the audit lead. So just as an example, we called out two of them in the report that I think were fairly high profile in nature. One event that took place in Portland where an individual shot and killed another individual, thus enacting violence and criminal violence. And then the event that took place December 21st of 2020 at the state capitol itself. So those are two of many of the examples that exist that are in the data set.
Next question is from Kirsten at KBEL. Kirsten, go ahead.
Good morning. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Just to kind of follow up with Genevieve's question, do we have an area by area breakdown of where we're seeing these incidents? Are we seeing them mostly in the Portland metro area? Or if we can kind of get an idea of where we're looking at, that would be very helpful.
So thank you for the question, Kirsten. The answer to your question is the data set that we used in this case is from the Center for International Strategic Studies, and it does include geo-located incident data. So we would be able to identify, at least in these cases, where that exists.
Genevieve, I think you have a follow-up question. Why don't we go to you next?
Thanks. I know a part of this report details law enforcement training and what needs to evolve in that sense. We've covered this really closely in Portland in the police officer shortage, law enforcement shortage across our area. At this point, police officers really aren't even able to respond to daily calls. How realistic is it that we can expect this kind of training for law enforcement in Oregon, and what's the timeline?
Casey or Kip, do you want to speak to anything in the report that gets to that?
I'll let Casey kind of handle that from the report, and then I got a comment or two outside of the report that I can help with that a little bit, hopefully.
Sure. And our answers will certainly overlap. So regarding training and the feasibility, I suppose, of implementation, when we suggest a recommendation, or in this case, a suggested action, because this was an advisory report and not an audit, then we look closely at, what are the actions that an agency can take to mitigate the risk that we've identified. And in this case, that would be enhanced training for the officers, as you noted. One of the things that we can't do is identify when and how the agencies do those actions. So that's going to be up to the management of that agency, how they go about instituting the suggested action. But recognizing that the action does need to be taken, obviously, is a first step into trying to get something done and started in that. And I'll let Kip kind of pick up from there.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'll just add a couple of real brief comments to that. One is I want to note that we have been looking at this great question, this critical area of law enforcement. In many recent audits, we issued earlier, I believe in January, our look at Oregon State Police Department, and particularly looking at highway patrol staffing and some of the training needs. And then we also, early in late 2021, issued an audit looking at the Department of Public Safety Standards and Training. Both of those, particularly the DPSST audit, had specific recommendations about training. Both of them had we're focused on recommendations about staffing. And to get you to the bottom line of your question, it requires commitment. It requires resources. That's part of the reason we're highlighting these risks, especially from, I think, our unique viewpoint that auditors have across the whole statewide enterprise. And so we can see some gaps and some sometimes redundancies in that framework. But I think what we're looking at is, I know it's up to our legislators. They're the ones that get, the authority and responsibility for making decisions of how we allocate our resources. But we have the responsibility of elevating risk that may require more resources. And in the two reports I just referenced, we don't know what the number is. There's a lot of variables, obviously, as we were looking at police reform and other efforts going on across the country and here in Oregon. So it's not an easy ask. But I think the public risk and safety concerns elevated by all three of these audits will hopefully help stakeholders prioritize those risks. So it's a great question. As Casey said, we don't have any authority to make those decisions, nor should we. But we are encouraging state leadership to look at how we're staffing these important public safety agencies.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'd like to know if you gave any thought when you were developing these recommendations to protecting privacy and civil liberties. I know those are issues that often run into conflict with enhanced law enforcement actions, and especially when it comes to confronting terrorism. What do you have any recommendations for how the state can balance those two competing priorities?
Casey, do you want to take that from kind of how we address that in the report? And if I have anything to add after that, I'll jump in.
Sure, and great question, Julia. Thanks for asking. It's something that came up very early in our effort on this. And so ultimately where we landed was, especially with recommendation to create external reporting for foiled plots and incidents especially, we noted that it's critical that this be done where such information doesn't violate privacy. So that's specifically one area in the report where we call out a need to be cognizant of the very real need to protect these civil liberties while trying to mitigate the risk of the event.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. Obviously, an excellent question. It is something we explicitly do address in the report. Do we have the remedy? Do we have the pathway? No, I mean, that's one of the, it's a lot of gray area in that space. But one, we completely agree that there has to be a balance between the right to speech and the right to privacy and the right, to monitor, violent extremism and that kind of stuff. But I would say this, I think that's where we're trying to drive with some of our recommendations about a statute and about better definitions and about better frameworks. So within that very gray area, that really interesting balance area, that we at least have a little bit more there in our state of Oregon to make those tough decisions and develop that tough policy on. But without going on too much into that area, it's a great question and it's something that we did not, I'm glad you brought it up because it's an important point to emphasize, and we did do that in the report.
And I believe you have a follow-up. Is that correct?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yep, there you go.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, forgive me, I'm doing this in the newsroom on my work phone. With my area by area breakdown that I talked about earlier, with that in mind, obviously here in Eugene, we're expecting an influx of people with the World 22 events. Would that potentially be a target for violence here in the future? Does the report kind of show any evidence that we could be in any danger?
I'll take that one. We don't. We didn't. Again, I know it can sometimes be a little frustrating for people or readers about audit products because we really go to controls and frameworks and measurements and things like that. So we don't really look at, like in this report, we didn't look at specific groups. We didn't look at specific future incidents or risk. But I would just say this, large public gatherings, high profile areas where, again, people driven by terrorist ideology, and I think the report really lays out the differences between, ideological violence and other types of violence. And so I think there's a lot that we can push out there. But yeah, generally, we're not in the business of predicting the future. And so we want to steer clear of that and did not speak to that in the report.
So that I think covers every hand that I'm seeing. Genevieve and Kirsten, yours are possibly just still up from previous questions. If anyone has follow-up questions or an additional question, we're happy to hang on for a while. We got plenty of time and just want to make sure we get everyone's questions answered. So I'll pause for a second to see if there is anyone else who would like to jump in. Feel free to come off mute and do so.
I actually do have another follow-up. We talked about, creating better definitions and statutes. What are the goals for measuring success here? And when could we possibly see the legislature moving forward with creating types of legislation?
Casey, can you take a stab at the first part of the question, and I'll take the second part?
Absolutely. So the goals for measuring success are one in our discussions with law enforcement officials, including the FBI, that are recognized as exceptionally difficult in this area because it's very difficult to prove a negative, as auditors well know. So in the instance where, say, a potential event or plot, as described by the FBI, is foiled, you could question, well, did they actually foil it? Because we don't know, because it didn't happen. So it is a challenge in the area that is well addressed or well discussed. And so what has been determined in this advisory report is that merely the act of reporting the information in the first place would be a step in the right direction. It was reported until 2012 publicly through the Department of National Intelligence. It is no longer publicly reported. So getting that at a state level to have the external reporting so that our legislators can understand the nature and extent of the issue would be a step in the right direction.
And just to add to your second part of that great question about legislative activity, one, and the report points this out, the legislature already has been taking action. We want to make sure that folks know, the state, one is a lot of this does fall under the federal legal framework for enforcement. And so we wanted to really, part of the report is to explain how these various federal, state, and local agencies work together. As far as the legislature, like I said, we highlight a few bills that they've been considering, some that they passed along this line. Obviously, they were in the building or work in the building that was attacked, so this is really prescient to them as an issue as well. We've also offered briefings for this report and have had one or two of those, and we'll have some after with individual legislators. And we just continue to plan to push our work, make sure they have access and understand where our work is, so it helps inform them. But yeah, we have no ability to predict or pressure legislators to work at any rate on this.
Have you noticed that as everything around you seems to decline, one thing still grows? It is the power of your rulers. None of their plans and directives have solved your problems or made your life better. The only result has been their increased control over you at the cost of your freedom. Do you know why? You gave them the power.